July 30th, 1945, 12:14 a.m., Philippine Sea, 600 miles west of Guam. The sonar operator's voice cracked as it tore through the radio channel. Torpedo in the water, bearing 030, 2 wakes, impact imminent. 90 seconds. That's all the time that stood between 1,200 American sailors and one of the worst naval disasters in United States history. 90 seconds. Between routine night watch and absolute chaos. 90 seconds before an 8,000-ton heavy cruiser would begin its final violent descent to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And in those 90 seconds, most of the men aboard the USS Indianapolis had no idea their lives were about to change forever. The first torpedo struck the forward starboard side at 12:14 and 15 seconds, ripping through the hull like a white-hot knife through paper. The explosion was so massive that it blew off 40 feet of the bow. Fuel tanks ruptured instantly. Aviation gasoline ignited. Within seconds, a wall of fire swept through the forward compartments where hundreds of sailors slept in their bunks. The second torpedo hit 12 seconds later, striking directly beneath the bridge. This one found its mark in the powder magazines and fuel storage. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, a fireball that rose 200 feet into the tropical night sky, visible for miles across the dark Pacific waters. Captain Charles McVay III was thrown from his cabin. The deck beneath him buckled and twisted. In the darkness, illuminated only by the hellish orange glow of burning fuel, he could hear his ship dying. The groaning of metal, the hiss of water flooding through wounds that couldn't be sealed, the screams of men being burned alive. The Indianapolis was going down, and she was going down fast. But what happened next would prove even more horrifying than the torpedoes themselves, because the sinking was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last 4.5 days, a nightmare of dehydration, madness, and predators circling in the blood-stained water. What those men would endure in the Philippine Sea would become one of the most harrowing survival stories ever recorded. If you find this story as incredible as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring more of them to you. Now, to understand how nearly 200 American sailors ended up in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no rescue coming, we need to go back to a secret mission so classified that it would directly contribute to the deaths of hundreds of men, back to a ship that had already earned its place in history, and back to a submarine commander who was about to become the most successful Japanese naval officer of the entire war. The USS Indianapolis was no ordinary ship. Launched in 1931, she was a Portland-class heavy cruiser that had served as the flagship of the United States Fifth Fleet. She had been President Franklin D. Roosevelt's preferred vessel for transportation, carrying him to diplomatic meetings in South America and across the Atlantic. Her decks had hosted admirals, generals, and heads of state. But in the summer of 1945, the Indianapolis was assigned a mission that would eclipse everything that came before. July 16th, 1945, 2 weeks before the sinking. The Indianapolis sat anchored at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. Her crew had been told nothing about their destination, nothing about their cargo, nothing about why armed Marines had suddenly appeared on their ship, standing guard over a 15-foot wooden crate and a small lead cylinder that was kept under constant watch. What Captain McVay didn't know, what only a handful of people in the entire world knew, was that his ship had just been loaded with the core components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. The wooden crate contained the firing mechanism. The lead cylinder contained the uranium-235 that would kill 80,000 people in a single flash of nuclear fire. The combined weight was barely a few hundred pounds, but the destructive potential was beyond anything humanity had ever created. Captain McVay received his orders directly from Admiral William Purnell. The instructions were simple: get to Tinian as fast as possible. Do not stop, do not deviate, do not fail. Every day you save, Admiral Purnell told McVay, is a day the war might end sooner. McVay understood the weight of that statement, even if he didn't understand what was in those containers. His crew had been reduced to prepare for the cargo. Only essential personnel remained. The Indianapolis would travel without escort, relying on speed alone to cross the Pacific. At 8:00 a.m. on July 16th, the Indianapolis cast off her lines and headed west. The crossing was brutal. McVay pushed his ship to the limit, maintaining speeds of over 29 knots through rough seas. The crew worked in shifts, keeping the engines running at maximum capacity. Lookouts scanned the horizon day and night for signs of Japanese submarines. Everyone aboard sensed the urgency, even if they couldn't articulate why. 10 days later, on July 26th, the Indianapolis arrived at Tinian. The secret cargo was unloaded by a small team of Army specialists who refused to speak with anyone. The wooden crate and the lead cylinder disappeared into the island's interior, headed for a heavily guarded airfield where the B-29 Enola Gay was being prepared for her mission. With the delivery complete, the Indianapolis received new orders. She was to proceed to Guam, then continue to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training exercises before joining the fleet, preparing for the invasion of Japan. Routine orders, standard deployment, nothing to suggest that the ship was sailing toward catastrophe. But here's what Captain McVeigh didn't know, what the Navy had failed to tell him. 3 days before the Indianapolis left Guam, a Japanese submarine had sunk the destroyer escort USS Underhill in the Philippine Sea, the same waters the Indianapolis was about to cross. Naval intelligence had detected increased submarine activity along the route. And the Indianapolis, which had just completed the fastest crossing of the Pacific in naval history, was being sent into hostile waters without a single escort vessel. Why? That question would haunt the survivors and their families for decades. The most likely answer is a combination of overconfidence and bureaucratic failure. The war was almost over. Japan was on the verge of surrender. The Indianapolis was a fast, experienced cruiser with a decorated captain. No one expected a single ship traveling at high speed to be in serious danger. They were wrong. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto stood in the conning tower of the I-58, scanning the dark waters through his night vision binoculars. The Japanese submarine had been on patrol for weeks, searching for American targets in the shipping lanes between Guam and the Philippines. Hashimoto was 36 years old, a veteran submarine commander with experience dating back to the Pearl Harbor attack. He was intelligent, methodical, and patient. Unlike some of his fellow officers who had grown reckless as Japan's defeat became inevitable, Hashimoto remained disciplined. He would find his target, he would take his shot, and he would make it count. At 11 p.m. on July 29th, the I-58 surfaced to recharge her batteries and refresh her air supply. The night was humid, the sea calm, visibility was poor due to cloud cover obscuring the moon. Perfect hunting conditions. At 11:35 p.m., Hashimoto's lookout spotted something on the horizon, a dark shape moving west to east, large, slow, unescorted. Hashimoto raised his binoculars. Through the darkness, he could make out the silhouette of a warship, the distinctive profile of an American cruiser. He felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained calm as he ordered the I-58 to dive and take up attack position. For the next 30 minutes, Hashimoto maneuvered his submarine into the perfect firing solution. He calculated the target's speed, heading, and distance. He prepared a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes, each carrying over 1,200 pounds of explosives. At 12:05 a.m. on July 30th, Hashimoto gave the order. Fire tubes 1 through 6. The torpedoes launched in sequence, their propellers churning the water as they raced toward the Indianapolis at 48 knots. Hashimoto watched through his periscope, counting the seconds. Aboard the Indianapolis, the men were settling into the night watch. The ship was traveling at 17 knots. Zigzagging had been suspended due to poor visibility, and the crew was looking forward to their arrival at Leyte. Most of the sailors were asleep in their bunks. Others were playing cards or writing letters home. Sonar operator Joseph Harrell was monitoring his equipment when he saw it. 2 distinct trails on his screen, moving fast, converging on their position. His blood went cold. Torpedo in the water, bearing 030, 2 wakes, impact imminent. The warning reached the bridge just seconds before impact. There was no time to evade, no time to sound general quarters, no time for anything. The first torpedo struck the starboard bow at 12:14 a.m., and the Indianapolis began to die. Now, I want you to understand what happened in the next 12 minutes, because 12 minutes is all it took for one of the most powerful warships in the American fleet to slip beneath the waves. 12 minutes of chaos, fire, and desperate decisions. When the first torpedo detonated, it triggered a chain reaction that no damage control could stop. The explosion ruptured the forward fuel tanks, sending thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline pouring through the lower decks. The gasoline ignited almost instantly. Within seconds, compartments that had been filled with sleeping sailors became furnaces. Men woke up burning. Their screams echoed through the metal corridors as they fought to reach ladders, hatches, anything that might lead to the open deck. Some made it, many didn't. The fire moved faster than any human could run, fed by the fuel that continued to pour from the ruptured tanks. The second torpedo hit 12 seconds later. This one struck the number 2 magazine where the ship's ammunition was stored. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. It blew out the entire midsection of the ship, creating a wound that couldn't be healed. The Indianapolis immediately began listing to starboard. The forward bow, nearly severed by the first explosion, began to drag down, pulling the ship's nose underwater. Captain McVeigh reached the bridge to find his communications officer trying desperately to send a distress signal. SOS, SOS, SOS. This is USS Indianapolis. We have been torpedoed. Position 12 out of Gruder 2N, 134 to 48E, sinking rapidly. Need immediate assistance. SOS, SOS, SOS. The message went out 3 times. What McVeigh couldn't know was that the radio room had been destroyed in the explosion. The emergency antenna was gone. Whether any of those distress calls reached anyone would remain a matter of desperate hope. On deck, chaos reigned. The explosion had killed the electrical power throughout most of the ship, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by the glow of fires. Men stumbled through corridors filled with smoke, feeling their way by memory. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony of groaning metal and rushing water. Captain McVeigh made his way to the emergency communication station, hoping to verify that the distress signal had been received. What he found instead was a scene of destruction. The radio shack was gone, replaced by twisted metal and flames. The backup systems were flooded. The Indianapolis was dying alone, and no one in the world knew it. At 12:18 a.m., just 4 minutes after the first torpedo hit, Captain McVeigh gave the order he had prayed he would never have to give. Abandon ship. All hands abandon ship. But here's the problem. The explosion had destroyed most of the ship's communication systems. The order couldn't be broadcast over the PA system. It had to be passed by word of mouth from sailor to sailor in the darkness and confusion of a dying ship. Some men heard the order and made it to the life rafts. Others never got the message. They stayed at their stations waiting for instructions that would never come as the water rose around them. The Indianapolis had 12 life rafts on board. In the chaos, only a handful were successfully launched. The rest were either destroyed in the explosions, trapped under debris, or went down with the ship because there was no time to cut them free. What most men grabbed instead were Kapok life vests, cork-filled flotation devices designed to keep a single person afloat. The vests worked. They would keep a man's head above water, but they offered no protection from the sun, no fresh water, no food, and no defense against what was circling beneath the surface. At 12:26 a.m., 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the USS Indianapolis broke in half. The bow section, already dragging underwater, separated from the rest of the ship with a sound that survivors would describe as a tremendous metallic groan, like the scream of a wounded animal. The forward half slipped beneath the waves almost immediately, taking with it hundreds of men who were still trapped inside. The stern section followed seconds later, rolling to starboard as it sank. Men who had made it to the deck were thrown into the water. Others were sucked down by the ship's momentum, dragged into the darkness by the vessel they had served. In less than a quarter hour, a ship that had carried presidents and admirals, that had just delivered the weapon that would end the war, disappeared beneath the Pacific Ocean. But for the men in the water, the nightmare was just beginning. Approximately 890 sailors survived the sinking. They floated in the darkness, scattered across several miles of ocean, clinging to life vests, debris, and each other. Some had managed to reach the few rafts that had been launched. Most had nothing but their kapok vests, and the hope that rescue would come soon. The sun rose on July 30th to reveal the full horror of their situation. The survivors were spread across an enormous area, isolated in groups ranging from a handful of men to clusters of more than 100. Without engines, without sails, without any way to navigate, they were at the mercy of the currents. And the currents were slowly pushing them apart. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, found himself in charge of the largest group, approximately 350 men floating in a loose formation near the center of the debris field. Haynes was a physician, trained to save lives. What he was about to witness would push him to the absolute limits of human endurance. The first problem was injuries. Many of the survivors had been burned in the fires. Others had broken bones, internal injuries, or had swallowed fuel oil that was now poisoning their systems. Haynes moved through the group, doing what he could with no supplies, no equipment, and no hope of evacuation. He found men with burns covering 80% of their bodies. He found men with compound fractures, bones protruding through flesh. He found men who had been blinded by the explosions and were calling out in panic, unable to see their companions or understand where they were. But the injuries were just the beginning. The Pacific Ocean at their location was approximately 4 miles deep. The water was warm, around 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. That warmth, which might have seemed like a blessing, would prove to be a curse. It attracted predators. No one knows exactly when the sharks arrived. Some survivors reported seeing fins within hours of the sinking. Others claimed the attacks didn't begin until the second day. What is certain is that by the afternoon of July 30th, the men of the Indianapolis were sharing the water with one of the ocean's most efficient hunters. The oceanic white-tip shark is not the largest shark in the sea. It typically reaches lengths of 10 to 13 feet, considerably smaller than the great white. But what it lacks in size, it makes up for in aggression and persistence. Oceanic white-tips are known as the shipwreck shark for a reason. They are scavengers, attracted to debris, blood, and the movements of struggling creatures in the water. And in the aftermath of the Indianapolis sinking, there was blood everywhere. The attacks began on the edges of the groups. Isolated men, wounded men, men who had drifted away from their companions. The sharks would approach slowly, circling, bumping their targets with their snouts to test for resistance. Then, with a burst of speed, they would strike. The screams carried across the water. Lieutenant Haynes tried to organize defenses. He ordered the men to form tight circles, facing outward, kicking at any sharks that approached. He told them to stay calm, to avoid splashing, to keep their bleeding wounds out of the water. But his advice was based on theory, not experience. No one had ever survived a situation quite like this. The sharks learned quickly. They discovered that the tight circles could be broken. All it took was one aggressive rush, one bite that drew fresh blood, and the formation would collapse in panic. Men would scatter, and the predators would pick them off one by one. Seaman first class. Harlan Twyble watched a shark take his friend right in front of him. One moment, the man was there, treading water, talking about home. The next moment, he was pulled under so fast that Twyble didn't even have time to reach for him. A few bubbles rose to the surface, then nothing. You'd see them coming, Twyble recalled decades later, these big black shapes just below the surface, and you'd try to warn people, but there was nothing you could do, nothing at all. The attacks continued throughout the day, and throughout the night, and into the next day. But the sharks weren't the only killers in the water. By the end of the first day, dehydration was beginning to take its toll. The survivors had no fresh water. They were surrounded by an ocean they couldn't drink. Some of the men, desperate and delirious, began to drink seawater anyway. This is where I need to explain something about human physiology, because what happened next is crucial to understanding the tragedy. Seawater contains approximately 3.5% salt, about 4 times the concentration that the human body can safely process. When you drink seawater, your kidneys attempt to expel the excess salt through urine. But to do that, they need fresh water, water that your body doesn't have. The result is a paradox of dehydration. The more seawater you drink, the thirstier you become. Your kidneys work overtime, pulling water from your tissues, your organs, your brain. The salt accumulates in your bloodstream, disrupting the electrical signals that govern your muscles, your heart, your mind. The early symptoms are thirst and fatigue. Then come muscle cramps, nausea, and confusion. Eventually, the brain begins to malfunction. Hallucinations set in. Men see things that aren't there. Islands on the horizon, ships coming to rescue them, fresh water just within reach. By the second day in the water, the hallucinations had begun. Marine Private Giles McCoy watched his companions lose their minds. Men who had been rational, disciplined soldiers just hours before were now babbling about hotels beneath the waves. They claimed the Indianapolis was still afloat, just below the surface, and that they could swim down to get food and water from the galley. Some of them tried. McCoy grabbed one sailor by the vest as he attempted to dive. "There's nothing down there," he shouted. "The ship is gone. It's at the bottom of the ocean." The sailor looked at him with empty eyes. "No," he said calmly. "I can see it. I'm just going to get a drink of water." Then he slipped out of his vest and dove beneath the surface. He never came back up. The madness spread like a contagion. Men began attacking each other, convinced that their companions were Japanese sailors or that they were hoarding secret supplies of water. Lieutenant Haynes watched helplessly as sailors who had served together for years tried to drown each other in fits of paranoid delusion. The strongest swimmers died first. They were the ones confident enough to attempt the dives to the underwater hotel. They were the ones who swam away from the group to investigate distant islands that turned out to be clouds or mirages. One by one, the men who should have survived the longest were consumed by their own hallucinations. And through it all, the sharks kept circling. Meanwhile, one of the most critical questions was being answered in the worst possible way. Did anyone receive the distress signals? Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, because the answer is yes. 3 separate naval stations received the Indianapolis's SOS messages, and none of them did anything. The first station to receive the distress call was in Leyte Gulf. The duty officer, Lieutenant Stuart Gibson, saw the message come through and immediately dismissed it as a Japanese trick. The enemy was known to broadcast false distress calls to lure rescue ships into ambushes. Gibson decided to wait for confirmation before acting. That confirmation never came, because Gibson never requested it. The second station was on Guam. Here, the commanding officer was reportedly drunk when the message arrived. His subordinates, unsure of what to do, chose to do nothing. The third station was in the Philippines. This time, the message was flagged for attention, but a junior officer decided it was above his pay grade and filed it for review by his superior. The superior never saw it. 3 chances to save 800 men, 3 failures. But the Navy's negligence didn't end there. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on her scheduled date of July 31st, no one raised an alarm. The reason? A directive issued by the commander of the Philippines Sea Frontier stated that the arrivals of combatant ships were not to be reported. The logic was security. The fewer records of ship movements, the harder it would be for Japanese intelligence to track the American fleet. The consequence was that no one noticed when the Indianapolis didn't show up. No search parties were dispatched, no planes were sent to investigate. The men in the water were simply forgotten. 4 days. That's how long it took for anyone to realize the Indianapolis was missing. 4 days of sharks and dehydration and madness and death. The rescue came by accident. On August 2nd, 1945, at 10:25 a.m., a Navy PV-1 Ventura bomber was on routine patrol over the Philippine Sea. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, noticed his antenna had come loose and dropped to a lower altitude to try to repair it. As he did, something caught his eye. An oil slick, miles long, spreading across the surface of the water. Gwynn followed the slick, expecting to find a Japanese submarine that had been damaged in an attack. Instead, he found something that made his blood run cold. Men, hundreds of men, scattered across the ocean, floating in groups, waving desperately at the plane passing overhead. Gwynn immediately radioed his base. His message was received with disbelief. There were no American ships missing in that area. There couldn't be hundreds of men in the water. It had to be a mistake. But Gwynn insisted, and his insistence saved lives. Within hours, a massive rescue operation was underway. Ships and planes converged on the area. PBY Catalina flying boats, designed for water landings, dropped into the waves to pull survivors directly from the sea. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks, piloting one of the Catalinas, made the controversial decision to land his aircraft, even though the water was too rough for safe operations. His plane was damaged in the landing, but he personally rescued 56 men, strapping some of them to the wings when the hull was full. Throughout the night of August 2nd and into August 3rd, the rescuers worked frantically. They found men barely alive, too weak to grab the ropes lowered to them. They found men driven completely insane, fighting their rescuers because they believed they were being attacked. They found men who had died just hours before help arrived, still floating in their life vests, their eyes staring at the sky they had watched for so long. And they found the sharks, still circling, still waiting. Of the approximately 890 men who went into the water after the sinking, only 316 were rescued alive. That number is worth repeating. Only 316 survived. Approximately 575 men died in the water over those 4.5 days. Some drowned, some died of their injuries, some died of dehydration and exposure, some killed each other in fits of madness, and hundreds were taken by sharks. The exact number of shark attack victims is impossible to determine. Many bodies were never recovered, others were found partially consumed. Conservative estimates suggest at least 150 men were killed by sharks. Some historians believe the actual number may be twice that. It remains the deadliest shark attack in human history, and it almost certainly will never be surpassed. But the tragedy of the Indianapolis didn't end with the rescue, because the Navy needed someone to blame. In the weeks following the sinking, as the survivors recovered in hospitals and the nation celebrated the end of the war, the Navy convened a court of inquiry. The question before them was simple: how could this have happened? The answer pointed to multiple failures. The failure to provide escort, the failure to act on the distress signals, the failure to notice the ship's non-arrival. Any one of these failures might have been understandable. All of them together represented a systemic breakdown in naval operations. But instead of accepting institutional responsibility, the Navy chose to court-martial Captain Charles McVeigh. The charges were twofold: failure to order abandoned ship in a timely manner, and hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag in enemy waters. The first charge was quickly dismissed. The evidence showed that McVeigh had ordered abandoned ship as soon as it was clear the vessel couldn't be saved, and that the failure to communicate the order was due to the destruction of the ship's systems, not any negligence on McVeigh's part. The second charge, failing to zigzag, became the centerpiece of the prosecution. Naval regulations required ships in combat zones to zigzag to make it harder for submarines to target them. McVeigh had suspended zigzagging on the night of the attack due to poor visibility. The prosecution argued this decision had contributed to the sinking. But here's where the trial took a remarkable turn. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had fired the torpedoes, was flown to Washington to testify. The prosecution expected him to confirm that zigzagging would have made a difference. Instead, Hashimoto said the opposite. It would have made no difference, Hashimoto told the court. We had the Indianapolis in our sights. Zigzagging would not have saved her. Our torpedoes would have found their target regardless. The testimony should have destroyed the prosecution's case. The enemy commander himself was saying that McVeigh's decision was irrelevant, but the court-martial proceeded anyway. On December 19th, 1945, Captain Charles McVay was found guilty of hazarding his ship. He was the only Navy commander in American history to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. The sentence was relatively light, a letter of reprimand that was later remitted, but the conviction stood, and it haunted McVay for the rest of his life. For the next 23 years, McVay lived with the burden of that verdict. He received hate mail from families who blamed him for their sons' deaths. He was passed over for a promotion. He retired from the Navy in 1949 and tried to rebuild his life as a civilian, but the ghosts of the Indianapolis followed him everywhere. On November 6, 1968, Captain Charles McVay III walked into his front yard, raised his service revolver, and took his own life. He was found clutching a small toy sailor, a gift from his grandson that he always kept close. The conviction had destroyed him. But the story still wasn't over. In 1996, a 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott watched the movie Jaws. One scene mentioned the Indianapolis, and Scott became fascinated. For a school history project, he began researching the sinking, interviewing survivors, and reviewing declassified documents. What Scott discovered was shocking. The Navy's own records showed that McVay had requested an escort and been denied. They showed that intelligence reports of submarine activity in the area had been withheld from him. They showed that the failure to act on the distress signals was a command failure, not McVay's responsibility. Scott's research attracted national attention. He testified before Congress, presenting evidence that convinced lawmakers the court-martial had been unjust. On October 30th, 2000, 55 years after the sinking, Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVay. The resolution stated that Captain McVay's record should now reflect that he is exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. The resolution couldn't restore McVay's life. He had been dead for 32 years. But it could restore his honor, and for the survivors, many of whom had fought for decades to clear their captain's name, it was a victory long overdue. Today, the USS Indianapolis is remembered as one of the most significant tragedies in American naval history. Memorials have been built, books have been written. The 316 survivors, now all gone, spent their final years ensuring that the men who didn't make it home were never forgotten. And what of the ship itself? For 72 years, the wreck of the Indianapolis lay hidden in the darkness of the Philippine Sea, 4 miles below the surface. Searches had been attempted over the decades, but the ocean is vast, and the records of the ship's position were imprecise. The Indianapolis seemed destined to remain lost forever. Then, in August 2017, a research team funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen located the wreck using advanced sonar technology. The images showed the Indianapolis sitting upright on the ocean floor, her hull still largely intact despite the damage from the torpedoes and the violence of her sinking. The discovery provided closure for the families of the lost sailors. Their loved ones had been found at last. The Indianapolis now rests in 18,000 feet of water, protected by the depth and darkness of the Pacific Ocean. She has been designated a war grave, and no attempts will be made to disturb her. The men who went down with their ship will remain there, far below the surface of the sea they defended. The USS Indianapolis carried the weapon that ended World War II. She delivered death in a lead cylinder, and she found it in the dark waters of the Philippine Sea. Her story is a reminder that heroism and tragedy are often intertwined, that the men who serve their countries do so knowing that the ocean, the enemy, and sometimes even their own institutions, can turn against them without warning. 12 minutes to sink, 4 days to be forgotten, 55 years to be exonerated. And 879 men who never made it home. Those men deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their names spoken. They deserve to have their story told. Because on July 30th, 1945, at 12:14 a.m., a sonar operator screamed, "Torpedo in the water." 90 seconds later, 800 men were drowning in the dark. And the world almost forgot. The survivors of the Indianapolis dedicated the rest of their lives to making sure that would never happen. They held reunions every year until the last of them was too frail to travel. They spoke at schools and veterans organizations. They wrote memoirs and gave interviews. They testified before Congress. They refused to let the Indianapolis become just another casualty statistic. One of those survivors was Harlan Twyble, the seaman who watched his friend disappear beneath the waves. Twyble lived to be 95 years old, and until the end of his life, he told his story to anyone who would listen. "I think about them every day," Twyble said in his final interview. "The ones we lost, the friends I made on that ship, the men who didn't make it home." He paused, and his voice grew quiet. They were good men. They deserved better than what they got, and they deserve to be remembered. This is their story. The story of the USS Indianapolis. The story of 1,196 American sailors who set out on a secret mission that changed the world. The story of torpedoes in the night and sharks in the water and 4 days of unimaginable horror. The story of men who died far from home, forgotten by the Navy they served, and remembered now, at last, by those of us who refuse to let history bury its mistakes. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but this secret has been told. The Indianapolis has been found, the captain has been exonerated, the men have been honored, and their story will never be forgotten again. Because some stories are too important to lose, some sacrifices are too great to ignore, and some nights in the Pacific Ocean are too dark to ever fade from memory. July 30th, 1945. 90 seconds. 800 men. Remember them. Let's take a moment to talk about what made this disaster so particularly devastating, beyond the obvious horror of sharks and dehydration and 4 days without rescue. The Indianapolis tragedy was a perfect storm of institutional failures, bad luck, and bureaucratic indifference. Each individual failure might have been survivable. Together, they created a catastrophe that killed more American sailors than any single enemy engagement of the entire Pacific War. Consider the chain of events that had to occur for 879 men to die. First, the Indianapolis had to be traveling without escort through waters known to contain enemy submarines. This decision was made by officers who either didn't know about the submarine activity or didn't consider it a serious threat. Either way, the ship that had just completed the most important delivery in military history was sent on her next mission without protection. Second, the ship had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Commander Hashimoto had been patrolling those waters for weeks without finding a target. If the Indianapolis had left Guam a day earlier or a day later, she might have missed the I-58 entirely. Third, the distress signals had to be ignored. 3 separate stations received the SOS, 3 separate opportunities to launch an immediate rescue. All 3 were squandered. 1 dismissed as a Japanese trick, 1 filed away by a junior officer, 1 ignored by a commander who was reportedly intoxicated. Fourth, the ship's non-arrival had to go unnoticed. The policy of not reporting combatant ship movements was designed to protect fleet security, but it also meant that no one was tracking the Indianapolis. When she failed to show up at Lady Gulf, no alarms were raised, no searches were initiated. Fifth, the rescue had to be delayed until the survivors had been in the water for over 4 days. Every hour that passed reduced the number who would live. If Lieutenant Gwynn hadn't noticed that oil slick on August 2nd, if he hadn't dropped altitude to fix his antenna, if he hadn't insisted to his superiors that he had found survivors, the death toll would have been even higher. Each of these failures had human beings behind it. Each of those human beings probably had reasons for their decisions that seemed logical at the time, but the aggregate effect was mass death. And then there's the question of the sharks. Much has been written about the shark attacks on the Indianapolis survivors. They are the most viscerally horrifying element of the tragedy, the detail that people remember even when they forget everything else. But the actual dynamics of those attacks are worth examining, because they reveal something important about survival psychology. The oceanic white-tip shark is an opportunistic predator. It doesn't hunt the way a great white does, stalking specific prey with patience and precision. Instead, it scavenges. It investigates disturbances in the water. It tests potential food sources to see if they're edible. When the Indianapolis went down, the sharks in the area were attracted by the explosion, the oil slick, the debris, and the blood. They came to investigate what had happened. What they found was a feast. But here's the thing. The sharks didn't attack indiscriminately. They tested. They circled. They bumped potential victims to gauge their response. Men who remained calm, who stayed in tight groups, who kicked at approaching sharks, were often left alone. The predators preferred easier targets. This is why so many attacks occurred at night, when visibility was low and men were exhausted from treading water all day. It's why isolated individuals were more likely to be attacked than those in groups. It's why the wounded and the delirious were taken first. The sharks were hunting the weak, and as the days wore on, everyone grew weaker. Lieutenant Commander Haynes, the chief medical officer, understood this dynamic almost immediately. He tried to organize his group into a defensive formation, but his efforts were hampered by several factors. Many of the men were injured and couldn't maintain position. The kapok life vests made it difficult to move quickly. And as dehydration set in, men began to lose the ability to follow instructions. By the 3rd day, Haynes was fighting a losing battle against physics, biology, and human psychology. The psychology of extreme survival situations is a field that has been extensively studied, and the Indianapolis disaster provides some of the most dramatic examples of how the human mind breaks down under stress. The hallucinations caused by dehydration and saltwater poisoning are well documented. The brain, deprived of water and bombarded by excess sodium, begins to malfunction. Neural pathways misfire. The ability to distinguish reality from fantasy erodes. What's less often discussed is the social breakdown that accompanies this cognitive decline. In normal circumstances, humans are social creatures. We cooperate, we help each other, we form groups for mutual protection and support. But under extreme stress, these bonds can dissolve rapidly. The survivors of the Indianapolis reported that by the third day, the group cohesion was collapsing. Men who had been shipmates, who had served together for months or years, were turning on each other. Some believed their companions were hoarding supplies. Others became convinced that Japanese soldiers had infiltrated the group. Still others simply lost the ability to recognize friend from foe. Marine Private Giles McCoy described watching a group of men attack one of their own because they believed he had hidden fresh water inside his life vest. They tore the vest apart, drowning the man in the process. There was no water. Lieutenant Haynes tried to maintain order, but he was one man against the tide of madness. He couldn't be everywhere at once. He couldn't stop every fight, prevent every suicide, save every victim. What Haynes did do was focus on the men who could still be helped. He moved through the group, identifying those who were still lucid, still capable of survival, and concentrating his limited resources on them. It was triage of the most brutal kind, and it probably saved lives. But the cost was enormous. Haynes later described the experience as the most traumatic of his life. He had been trained to save people, and he had been forced to watch hundreds die. Now let's talk about the rescue, because the rescue itself was a remarkable story of determination and heroism. When Lieutenant Gwynn's report reached the naval base at Peleliu, it was met with confusion. There were no ships listed as missing in that area. The idea that hundreds of American sailors could be floating in the Philippine Sea without anyone knowing seemed impossible. But Gwynn was insistent, and his urgency was compelling. A PBY Catalina flying boat was dispatched to investigate, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks. What Marks found when he arrived at the scene exceeded his worst expectations. The survivors were scattered across miles of ocean. Many were barely conscious. Some were clearly dying, and circling among them were dozens of sharks. Marks faced a difficult decision. The PBY Catalina was designed for water operations, but the sea state that day was marginal for landing. The swells were large enough to damage the aircraft. Standard protocol would have been to remain airborne and coordinate rescue efforts by radio. But Marks could see the sharks. He could see men being attacked. And he knew that by the time surface ships arrived, many of those men would be dead. He made the call to land. The landing was rough. The Catalina's hull was damaged on impact, rendering the aircraft unable to take off again. But Marks was now in the water, and he began pulling survivors aboard. When the aircraft's cabin was full, Marks began strapping men to the wings. By the time other rescue vessels arrived, the Catalina was carrying 56 survivors, far more than it was designed to hold. The plane would never fly again, but those 56 men would live. Marks received the Air Medal for his actions that day. He later said he didn't consider himself a hero. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said. "You see men dying, you try to save them. That's all." Other rescue pilots followed Marks' example. Throughout the afternoon and evening of August 2nd, aircraft converged on the area, dropping rafts, supplies, and markers to help surface vessels locate the survivors. The destroyer escort, USS Cecil J. Doyle, arrived around midnight and began the laborious process of pulling men from the water. The rescue continued through August 3rd. More ships arrived. More survivors were found. But as the search expanded, it also revealed the full extent of the tragedy. Many of the bodies recovered showed signs of shark attack. Others had died of dehydration, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Still others had simply drowned, their life vests waterlogged and useless after days in the ocean. Of the 316 men rescued alive, many were in critical condition. They were suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, exposure, infected wounds, and psychological trauma. Several died in the hours and days after rescue, bringing the final death toll to approximately 879. The survivors were taken to hospitals across the Pacific for treatment. They were interrogated by Navy investigators eager to understand what had happened. They were told, in many cases, not to speak publicly about their experiences. The war was almost over. Morale was important. The Indianapolis disaster was not the story the Navy wanted told. For decades, many of the survivors kept their silence. They returned to civilian life, raised families, built careers, but the memories never faded. The nightmares never stopped. The guilt of survival, of being alive when so many shipmates were dead, never disappeared. This is a phenomenon that psychologists now recognize as survivor's guilt, and it was endemic among the Indianapolis survivors. Many of them struggled with depression, alcoholism, and other manifestations of trauma. Some never fully recovered. Captain McVeigh was not the only man destroyed by what happened on July 30th, 1945. He was just the most visible casualty. The court-martial of Captain McVeigh deserves closer examination because it reveals something important about how institutions respond to disasters. The Navy in 1945 was reeling from the realization that one of its heavy cruisers had been sunk without anyone noticing for 4 days. This was a systemic failure of catastrophic proportions. If the public learned the full extent of what had happened, the ignored distress signals, the failure to report the ship missing, the complete breakdown of tracking procedures, the consequences would be severe. Someone had to be blamed, and Captain McVeigh was the obvious choice. He was the commanding officer. He was responsible for his ship. The fact that he had been denied escort, denied intelligence about submarine activity, denied the basic coordination that should have ensured his distress call was received and acted upon, these facts were inconvenient. They pointed to failures at levels far above McVeigh's pay grade. The decision to prosecute McVeigh for failing to zigzag was, in retrospect, almost absurd. Standing orders allowed captains discretion on zigzagging based on conditions. The night of the sinking had been dark and overcast. Zigzagging in those conditions was of questionable value and reduced the ship's speed. Multiple naval experts testified that McVeigh's decision was reasonable. And then there was Hashimoto's testimony. The prosecution brought the enemy commander to Washington expecting him to support their case. Instead, Hashimoto undermined it completely. He stated clearly that zigzagging would not have prevented the sinking. His submarine had the Indianapolis targeted from miles away. The ship's fate was sealed the moment she entered his patrol area. Logic dictated acquittal. The evidence pointed to acquittal, but the court convicted McVeigh anyway. Why? The most likely explanation is institutional self-preservation. By convicting McVeigh, the Navy could claim that the disaster was the result of one officer's poor judgment rather than systemic failures. It was a convenient narrative, and it allowed the admirals who had actually failed the Indianapolis to escape accountability. McVeigh understood what was happening. He understood that he was being sacrificed. And he accepted it with the dignity of a naval officer who believed in duty even when his institution had abandoned him. But the conviction broke something inside him. For the rest of his life, McVeigh received letters from families blaming him for their sons' deaths. Some were angry, some were pleading, all of them were painful. "Every time I receive one of those letters," McVeigh once said, "I die a little inside." The exoneration in 2000 came too late for McVeigh, but it wasn't too late for the survivors. For men like Harold Bray, Giles McCoy, and Harlan Twyble, men who had spent decades defending their captain and seeking justice, the congressional resolution was validation. It confirmed what they had always known. McVeigh was not responsible for the disaster. The system had failed. The captain had simply been the scapegoat. The survivors held their final reunion in 2017, the same year the wreck of the Indianapolis was discovered. By then, only 22 of them were still alive. Today, none remain. The last survivor of the USS Indianapolis, Harold Bray Jr., died on November 16, 2024, at the age of 99. He had spent his final decades speaking about the disaster, ensuring that the men who died were never forgotten. "I survived for a reason," Bray said in his final years, and that reason was to tell this story, to make sure people remember what happened to us, to make sure they remember the men who didn't make it home. The story of the USS Indianapolis is ultimately a story about memory and justice. For 50 years, the Navy tried to forget the Indianapolis, but the survivors refused to let the memory die. They organized. They testified. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, and eventually the truth emerged. The Indianapolis now rests at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, protected by the depth and the darkness. The men who went down with her are still there, entombed in the ship they served. But they have been found, and they have been remembered. The USS Indianapolis was lost on July 30th, 1945. She was found on August 19th, 2017. In between those two dates, 72 years passed, but the ocean kept their ship safe. And when the time came, she was there, waiting to be found. The men of the USS Indianapolis rest in peace now. They have earned it. And we, the living, have a responsibility to remember them. July 30th, 1945. 12:14 a.m. Torpedo in the water. 90 seconds later, everything changed. 879 men died in the Pacific Ocean. 316 survived to tell the story. And now you know it too. Remember them. The story of the Indianapolis isn't just a tragedy. It's a testament to human endurance and the stubborn refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. Captain Charles McVeigh was exonerated. The survivors got their resolution. The ship was found. It took 55 years, but it happened. And now it's yours to carry forward. July 30th, 1945. The Philippine Sea. 879 souls. Never forget.